Now, the C-SPAN series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, and explores the life and career of our 41st president.
Mr. President, what is it that you want this library to do?
I want it to accurately reflect the 41st presidency in the United States of America. And I think it does. And it takes, my mother always said, nobody likes a bragger. And so I apologize to my mother long in heaven for making, because it is all about me, but it's also about the presidency, how it works, how supportive the staff, the top staff was, how the system works. And I think it's just a kind of a vignette look at history through the time of the 41st president.
And what about the document side of it, the presidential documents? What do you hope that historians...
Well, I think that'll mainly be used by historians. They'll come, they'll examine in depth a lot of things on the domestic side, the Americans for Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, all these kinds of pieces of legislation. The history is there. What cabinet officer said to the president, how's that kind of stuff work? And then in Foreign Affairs, it'll document the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, certainly Desert Storm, and so and hopefully this hemisphere, the capture and eventual trial of Manuel Noriega. So there's a lot of information here, a lot about China, where I served, and feel comfortable about China. I like China, and I think people can get an insight as to why I feel that way.
What's your philosophy on the timing of presidential records being released for historians?
I have no feeling on that. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, sooner the better. But there's some things that are confidential, and they're going to, as far as I'm concerned, they'll stay confidential. I mean, you don't want to get into the media like, who won, who said this, how come he didn't do what so-and-so said. I mean, for serious historians, it'd be great, but for trivial people that want to just tie something in, well, Cheney said this then, now he says this. I mean, I'm not interested in providing information for that. But we're governed by the laws here, and we just follow them.
What presidents have kept over the years has changed, and what they've done to keep different records has changed. What advice would you give to future presidents on what to keep?
Well, you mean keep separate from something like this?
No, just keep in general. I mean,
I think you need to be sure you've got accurate diary material, whether it's a diary itself or not, of what actually went on, how you reached decisions. And I think we did pretty well on that. I mean, that's the important part of it, is that how the president looks at these problems, how he makes this decision as opposed to that one. And you can get it all here.
That, of course, is former President George H.W. Bush in a recent interview, talking about his presidential library and offering his views about the keeping and public release of presidential records. We'll be showing more of this exclusive interview in our program tonight, as well as hearing from the former president as he tours his newly renovated library in College Station, Texas. And you'll also see several of his appearances before the Gridiron Club's annual dinner, where journalists and high-ranking political figures interact. Since 1885, every president except Grover Cleveland has attended the Gridiron Dinner, and this event has always been closed to press coverage. But tonight, for the first time, you'll see some of the skits that President Bush performed for the Gridiron in 1990, 91, and 92. And that's a photograph of George Herbert Walker Bush with his very young son, the future President George W. Bush. Our cameras are going to be live for the Bush Library, and throughout the evening we'll show you some of their holdings and also some of their exhibits. This is all part of our 12-week Presidential Library's History Uncovered special television series, and tonight our focus is on the 41st President, George Herbert Walker Bush. Our consulting historian for this entire project has been Richard Norton Smith. Many of you have been with us throughout the the 11 weeks we're at right now and have gotten to know this gentleman. He's helping us understand the modern presidency. I'm going to ask you to tell people about Bush 41. As he came into the White House, he had really a lifetime of public service in various positions.
That's true.
What started that tradition for him?
Well, it was very much a family tradition. I mean, all of us are obviously influenced by our parents, but in the case of George Bush 41, the influence turned out to be historic. You heard the president himself quote his mother, Dorothy, who told him not to be a braggart, or nobody likes braggadocio. There are various renditions of it. And that would come back, in effect, at a critical moment in the history of the Cold War to influence the president in ways that were hotly debated then and are seen perhaps in a different light today. His father, Prescott Bush, was a United States Senator from Connecticut, a classic Eisenhower moderate Republican.
From what years?
I think it was 53 to 63, but most of the 50s and early 60s, quite close to Ike. And in many ways, I think his son George is an Eisenhower Republican.
Would you also, can you rattle off, and there's quite a long list,
There is.
Of the key positions that he held?
You bet. Well, first of all, on his 18th birthday, he enrolls in the Navy. He's the youngest Navy pilot in World War II, is a war hero in the Pacific. Comes back, marries Barbara Pierce, his sweetheart, in 1944. They go to live in Texas. He goes into the oil exploration business and then into politics. And runs for office in Texas in the 1960s. His migration to the Sun Belt mirrors the ongoing transformation of the Republican Party. And that is a theme that will play out throughout the Bush career. He's elected to the Congress in 1966. Then in 1971, following defeat for the United States Senate, there's a series of appointed positions. He's chairman of the Republican National Committee. He is the ambassador in all but name to China, head of the CIA, and runs for president in 1980, loses to Ronald Reagan, who makes him his vice president, and 8 years later, as the rest, as they say, is history. With
his father being United States Senator, George H.W. Bush had his eye on the U.S. Senate in 1964. Will you tell us a bit about that campaign? Yeah, 1964, of course, is a pivotal turning point for the Republican Party. And in Texas already, Lyndon Johnson was vice president of the United States. Just a few months, of course, before this election, he'd become president following the assassination of John Kennedy. When LBJ vacated his Senate seat, it was taken by a Republican, first since Reconstruction, a man named John Tower, who was a very hard-shell conservative. So George Bush ran as a Goldwater conservative in 1964, and I suspect probably for a lot of viewers this ad may come as a bit of a surprise. And this is our first bit of video we're going to show you tonight. In 2 hours it'll be full of behind-the-scenes video that shows you more about the personal side of a president. This is 1964 Senate campaign ad, and see how different campaign ads were back then. Let's take a look.
This is Dorothy Bush. She's sure she wants her dad to become a United States Senator, but she's not sure what it means. These are active supporters of George Bush. They're sure they want him to become a senator too, because they know what it will mean to Texas if Ralph Yarborough is permitted to continue in public office. George Bush doesn't have much time for backyard games anymore. He's traveling, talking, studying, and campaigning.
I believe that every man and woman with a stake in the future of our great nation must shoulder much more responsibility in politics. Otherwise, this nation will be surrendered once and for all to the ever-expanding government control so fervently championed by my opponent. The answer to our country's continued greatness lies in the unleashing of a new wave of individual initiative to revitalize our free enterprise system.
That was George Bush speaking. His political philosophy is sound, realistic, and in keeping with our American way of life. The issues are clear-cut and concise. Hear them now.
We must cut out wasteful pork barrel projects. We must balance the budget and then provide a sensible tax cut for all Americans. The tragic policy that permits us to fight wars we cannot win must be done away with. Might does not make right, but might and right together can keep the communist world from carrying out its threat to bury us. Our foreign aid should be drastically reduced, except in those areas where technological and military assistance are necessary to the defense of the free world. We must not give foreign aid to communist countries. Job opportunity and educational opportunity for all, justly administered by the state and local government, are the real answers to civil rights problems. We must not permit lawless attempts to try the issue in the streets. The United States has taken the responsibility for the freedom of the Western world and should not relinquish that responsibility to the United Nations General Assembly. All nations should pay their dues or lose their votes. We must reappraise our present oil and meat import programs. The programs now in effect have seriously hurt these two basic Texas industries. Morality, like honesty, is not a matter of degree. The Estes Baker scandals must be fully disclosed and measures taken to prevent such acts of immorality.
George Bush, the man and the candidate for the United States Senate. When George Bush hits the campaign trail, he leaves a great deal behind. The Bush home is a busy one and a happy one, with 5 healthy and active children. Little Dorothy is only 5. She's looking forward to starting school, while young George, the oldest Bush boy, is already a college freshman. He spent his entire summer working at Bush headquarters, assembling campaign materials, answering phones, and sweeping up, too. The Bush family is closely knit. They attend church together Sunday mornings. Then they head for home and backyard sports. George was quite a college athlete and still does pretty well, but he takes his lumps along with the others and doesn't complain too much. The youngsters return the compliment by not complaining about his cooking. In business, George Bush is a decision maker. Within the framework of our free enterprise system, he founded and built a highly successful oil drilling company, and he knows his business from the ground up. He thinks it's important that the men who run our nation know what it means to borrow money and pay it back and meet a payroll. George Bush knows what the risks are when a man undertakes a grave responsibility. Come to think of it, that's pretty important if you're to be a United States Senator. This sincerity and very personal concern for the welfare of our nation are easy to recognize when you hear George Bush talk, when you meet him and shake his hand. This helps explain why George has so many supporters and why they're working so hard to help elect George Bush, U.S. Senator from Texas.
And on your screen you see a photograph of George Bush campaigning in Texas. Richard Norton Smith, his appeal to Texas voters, ultimately not successful in 1964. What kind of themes distinguish him from Ralph Yarborough?
Well, Ralph Yarborough was a classic New Deal liberal. And it's interesting, you know, George Bush, remember Lyndon Johnson, of course, is from Texas, and he had very long coattails, and no doubt he carried Yarborough to victory. Bush ran 200,000 votes ahead of Barry Goldwater in the state of Texas. He got about 43% of the vote, which was, under the circumstances, a very respectable showing. And it really set him up for a rematch 6 years later with Yarborough.
We're going to take you now to the George Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas. You're looking at a live picture of it. And inside, we want to introduce you to our host there for the evening, Warren Finch, who is the director of the library. And he has with him one of the 116 scrapbooks that First Lady Barbara Bush deeded to the Presidential Library. Good evening, Mr. Finch. Thanks so much for letting us join you tonight. That's quite a large scrapbook. When did the First Lady start this process, and what did she tend to keep in them?
Well, she started the process back when she and the President first got married, back in the Yale days. And over the years, she accumulated now about 116 of these scrapbooks. You can see they're rather large. She kept all kinds of material. She kept one on each one of the children, and she kept material on the President's career, his CIA career, UN career, and then just family photographs and articles from newspapers.
Right behind you is an example of some of the early days pages, the interior part of the scrapbook. If you can do two things at once there, can you tell us what we're looking at?
Yes, this is an early scrapbook from his congressional career, and she's pasted in one of his congressional reports, and then on the right-hand side you see an article from the Hartford Times talking about the fact that George Bush might be a candidate for governor of Texas.
So she would clip articles from the newspaper that would chronicle her husband's political career.
Yes, and because of it, we have this just huge wealth of material that we wouldn't have otherwise. Arguably, gluing them into the scrapbooks probably is not the best, but the fact that she did do that, all this material survived, and we have it in our archive collection, and she has been great in donating all 116 scrapbooks to the library.
Well, tell us how the library came to be located in College Station, Texas, and more facts for people who have not been there about how large you are, what kind of holdings you have, and what the museum portion is like.
Well, the holdings include about 38 million pages of the President's papers, his vice presidential papers, Quayle's vice presidential papers, and we have a large holding of his personal papers, including some of the diaries and letters he wrote to people during his career. We also have about 2 million photos from his presidential and vice presidential career, plus a lot of personal photos, material going all the way back to a 1924 tape of the President taking his first steps at Kennebunkport, Maine, and then we play here in the museum a film of him being rescued when he was shot down at Chichijima during World War II. We also have about 5,000 beta cassettes that were taken by White House TV, and quite a collection of off-the-air coverage during his 4 years as president.
And why and how did it come to be in College Station?
Well, he gave one of his very first foreign policy addresses here in College Station, and there were a number of people here in College Station that were very interested in getting the library, and they lobbied him very early in his career, or very early in his presidential career, to get the library here. The library made College Station Texas A&M made a great proposal, a 90-acre site. There's a Bush School here of government and public service. I think the fact that Texas A&M had been a military school and still had a military component to the university probably played a factor, and he felt welcome here. Whenever he came here, the students were very welcoming to him when he walked around campus, when he gave a speech, and I think that also had a big factor in why the library was located here.
When did the library first open?
We opened in November of 1997, so we just passed our 10th anniversary here in College Station.
And you've been closed for a while for renovations. How did that all come about?
Yes. About 9 months ago, we closed the museum. We've been planning this for a couple of years now in order to redo the entire exhibit. The foundation raised, and the Bush Board, Foundation Board supported an $8.2 million renovation of the museum. We went from 12 audiovisual displays to now we have 100. What we wanted to do was to include documents and artifacts and news coverage into the museum. So through interactive kiosks, interactive computers, we've included that kind of material into the museum. We've also, one of the main things we did was we put in an Oval Office. When we first built the library, we decided not to put an Oval Office in the museum because every other presidential library had one. But what our visitors wanted to see was President Bush's Oval Office. So what we did is we created an Oval Office that you can walk into and sit behind the desk and pretend like you're in the seat of power.
And our time is running out here because we've got to get to the exhibits and the like, but I understand there is actually a very interesting personal story about the renovation of the library that has to do with his friendship with President Clinton.
He went to the Clinton Library, and he just loved the way it looked, and he loved the audio and the video that were in the Clinton Library, and so he decided that he wanted to update his library.
Well, next week we will be at the Clinton Library, so viewers will have an opportunity to see all your renovations and then see how the Clinton Library turned out. Tonight, those of you who are watching will be able to see some of the new exhibits, and we're going to take you on a partial tour of the Bush Presidential Library. Right now, back to more of the content of our program and learning more about the career of George H.W. Bush. His 2 terms in Congress, Tell us a little bit about the time that he spent in the House of Representatives, and then we'll hear the president, former president today, reflecting on that time.
Well, 1966 was a very different campaign from 64. First of all, it was for a House district. It wasn't statewide. It was in Houston. In Texas, they say the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead armadillos. But George Bush ran very much a middle-of-the-road campaign for the House in 1966. It was a Republican year, and Republicans did well in Texas, and he was among them. And he was elected to 2 terms. In fact, he was so popular the second time around, 1968, he ran unopposed. The Democrats did not oppose him. So by 1970, Richard Nixon talks him into leaving the House, running for the Senate, again against Ralph Yarborough, the liberal Democratic senator, thinking this would be the perfect rematch. And then fate intervenes. Yarborough loses his primary to a conservative Democrat named Lloyd Bentsen. And lo and behold, George Bush loses his second Senate race, narrowly.
Just a few days ago, the former president sat down for an interview at his library with our colleague Connie Debeley. And throughout the evening, you're going to see clips from that interview. Here's one of those where the former president talks about his time in Congress.
People who come here will also see a big dome replica of the Capitol, and that's all about the 4 years that you spent in the House of Representatives. You've written that that time was a kind of a frustrating time for you.
Well, I don't remember writing that. That's my problem, is memory, but might well have been. I was a junior member on the Republican side in a Democratic-controlled Congress. I can think of other more exciting situations than that. And so it was frustrating, but it was a wonderful time because I made a lot of friends that still last. We had a great large class elected when I was elected. Many of them dying off, unfortunately. But I enjoyed the House, but I didn't feel I was really doing anything. I was good about constituent service. I looked after our constituents, but it wasn't charging forward. It wasn't like making decisions every day.
Who were some of those people that you met in Congress that you would maybe put on your great Americans list?
Oh, well, there's tons of them, but I mean, I just talked today to Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt of Arkansas, who I love dearly as a friend, and I learned a lot from him. We had a lot of them. Bill Steiger was a young congressman from Wisconsin, much younger than I, and he did a wonderful job, and it excited a lot of young people to be involved in politics. And I hate to start down the list, but there's many. I got along with the leadership. I had great respect for Bob Michael, who was our leader, and Johnny Rhodes, subsequently deceased. And this was a good quality group, even though we were not calling all the shots. The Democrats were doing that. But it was, I had good friendships across the aisle.
It's written on that that you learned 4 things in Congress. Never get personal, do your homework, persuade, don't intimidate, and be considerate. Now, what do you think? Do you think today's Congress works under those principles?
I think there should be more of that. I think there's a kind of an antagonistic feeling in Congress, kind of personal attacks, more than existed back in 1967, 68. We had some of that, but there was an ability to work across the aisle, and now it's kind of bitter and personal.
Is that to the detriment of the country?
I don't think it helps anything. It turns a lot of people off from politics. But again, I don't blame the Congress. They got plenty of things out there. I blame the media to some degree, because it's gotcha. It's always some headline. It's some point of controversy, and that climate does not encourage cooperation, civil behavior, and maybe that's easy for me to say at this stage in my life, because I'm not upwardly mobile. I'm not trying to go anywhere. I'm not trying to make any statements. I'm not trying to be on Meet the Press. I'm just glad I'm here talking to you. But maybe if I were still charging forward, I'd view it differently. But I think it cries out for civility.
Warren Finch, when George Bush lost his second bid for the United States Senate, what did he do next with his public career?
After he left, after his second bid for the United States Senate, he went and served as ambassador to the United Nations.
And what's significant about the period that he was at the UN?
Well, there's several things that are significant. One, the Munich Olympics were during that period, and there was the terrorist incident at the Munich Olympics where the Israeli athletes were killed. And the Israelis bombed some Palestinian areas, and they were condemned by the UN. And George Bush, because the Palestinians weren't also condemned for the terrorism incident at Munich, cast only the second UN veto in the United Nations. And also, I think he actually probably advocated a two-China policy, but that was not the policy that was enacted. And was rather disappointed.
Richard Norton Smith, in 1972, his career takes another turn.
It does indeed. Following the landslide re-election of Richard Nixon, he is looking to recast his second term, and George Bush is someone who was seen as a comer. I think he felt a certain obligation to him as well politically because of luring him into that Texas Senate race in 1970. So he discussed several jobs with him, but they were number two positions, I think deputy positions at State and Treasury. And Bush really, at this point in his career, he really wanted to run something. And so I don't think it was his first choice, but he was a good soldier and said yes when the president offered him the chairmanship of the Republican Party.
Warren Finch, we are going to see a lot of video and photographs tonight, but I've heard it said of George Bush that in some ways he wrote his way to the White House, that over the years he was an inveterate letter writer and later a diarist. Can you tell us about George Bush's writings?
Well, he started, the earliest letters we have, a large collection of are his World War II letters. And he writes these great letters home to his mom and dad during World War II. And he kept a diary when he was at the RNC. He also kept a diary when he was in China. But I think it's, in many ways, it's the way you see into George Bush, his personality through his letter writing and his diaries.
Our viewers will remember that just in recent years, the former president published a collection of letters as a book. Right now, we're going to hear his own thoughts from just recently about the keeping of diaries.
You kept diaries for years? Your letter writing?
I'd be sporadic in that, unfortunately. But I did, and right now, here we are at Texas A&M University. A scholar here is going to publish the diaries I kept on China. And that goes way back to the 70s, the mid-70s. And he takes it and edits it, and I said, oh, who the heck's going to be interested in what I thought way back in the 70s about my experience in China? And I'm now convinced that there will be some interest of the China scholars and others, because China is so fascinating now. So I never thought when I was keeping that this will be a part of a president's record.
Did you keep diaries during your vice presidential and presidential years?
Sometimes. I wished I'd done better on that. But yes, and some of those will be made public. And what I don't want to do is, be in the business of hurting feelings. If I might write down, I thought Joe Jones over here did a lousy job. I'm too old to be hurting people. I don't want to do that. And so to the degree that I have the say over whether that gets public or not, I don't want it to be public.
Warren Finch, we're looking at a diary there, and I'm going to have you, as we look at this, have you talk about what kinds of diaries you have in the collection and how the president kept them and how many of them he gave to you.
Well, we have this RNC diary that you're looking at here. We also have the China diary he was talking about. And like I said, we have a huge collection of letters and several others. In most cases, he dictated them. He dictated them either into a cassette tape recorder or onto a dictaphone. We're not sure which. And then they were later transcribed. And what you see here is the transcribed copy of his RNC diary.
Do you have the dictaphone recordings in the library's collection?
We don't. We don't know if they still exist, if once the diaries were transcribed, if those tape recordings were kept or not.
Throughout this program tonight, we're going to read to you some of the diary notations that the former president made. This first one, before I read it, the date of it is July 31st, 1974, and so that the content makes sense, what was happening right then?
We are in the death throes of the Nixon presidency. This is a little more than a week before the president actually announced his intention to resign.
And here's what he wrote on July 31st. The president looked uncomfortable once he smiled over to me with his lips said, "George," smiled and looked warm, and my heart went totally out to him, even though I felt deeply betrayed by his lie of the day before. The man is amoral. He has a different sense than the rest of the people. He came up the hard way, he hung tough, he hunkered down, he stonewalled. He became President of the United States, and a damn good one in many ways, but now it has all caught up with him. All the people he hated, Ivy League, press, establishment, Democrats, privilege, all of this ended up biting him and bringing him down. By the way, the complete citation of this diary is on our website. We've established a website for this series at cspan.org, Presidential Libraries, with more than 1,000 pieces of digitized artifacts from the 12 presidents that we're featuring. So if you want to read the rest of it and other diary notations from the president, they are there. Set that very strong period of, and those are very strong words, into some context.
Well, it's extraordinary. You know, most politicians are not very reflective. It's a paradox that these people who make history are always saying, "I don't look back." What they really mean is they don't look within. And that's what makes this diary and these entries all the more remarkable. Because what we're eavesdropping on, as any reader of a diary is an interior dialogue. It's a debate that George Bush is having with himself between values, in effect, between loyalty to his president and loyalty to his party, and the values that were really instilled in him by Prescott and Dorothy Bush, and that Richard Nixon's conduct in Watergate so offended.
After the Nixon resignation and new president installed, there was a hunt for a vice president, and that's what the subject of our next diary notation, August 6, 1974. Here's what he had to say. "We have had a lot of press calls about Ford picking me for vice president. I'm convinced that it won't happen, and almost that it shouldn't, because the vice president needs something separate, apart, and clean. And unfairly or not, I may have tracked it in and kind of spread it around the living room carpet, not by design and hopefully not by character, but rather by an association. It's a weird, weird world."
Well, again, what a conflicted outlook. He clearly would like to be vice president. And in fact, this is not the first time. Back when Spiro Agnew resigned a year earlier, supporters of Bush had, in effect, petitioned Nixon to make him vice president. At that point, he picked Gerald Ford. He was very seriously considered by Ford. In fact, I think he was the number 2 candidate. But here at the same time is someone who is concerned that his association through the RNC with the party responsible for Watergate may make him politically unpalatable.
And I jumped ahead a little bit, so I need to go back and find one from August 7th of 74, and it's all from the same time period, so it'll all get together. "At night before going to sleep, I made the determination that I should, in fairness and honesty, send the president a letter suggesting that he resign. I wrote him a very short letter and dictated it to Tom Lias. Jane typed it, Tom took it down to the White House and gave it to General Haig," that's Alexander Haig. "I then called Haig in order to tell him what I had done."
Well, and again, in context, this is the end of the day. There had been a cabinet meeting earlier that day, which was frankly surreal, in which the president announced that he wanted to talk about the #1 problem facing America, inflation. And at that point, Vice President Ford broke in. This was after the so-called smoking gun tape. And in fact, George Bush, who attended cabinet meetings as RNC chairman, tried to become part of the conversation as well. And I think at the end of the day, this is just not on him, and he decided he had to put in writing his beliefs.
And Warren Finch, you have the letter that George Bush just described.
Well, we do. We have the notes that he wrote. He was out in California for an RNC fundraiser, which did not take place. It was staying at the Beverly Wilshire. And he wrote these notes on the stationery for the hotel and basically says, what the letter says, in my considered opinion, he's telling the president that he thinks it's now time for him to resign. And he goes on to say that he doesn't want to seem disloyal, but he thinks he would be disloyal if he didn't tell the president his opinion.
So there he is, drafting it in his own hand, changing words around for a letter to suggest to the president that he should resign his office. Where is the finished letter? Do you know in which library or where it sits today?
I do not. We have the draft, but I do not know where the original letter, whether it's in the Nixon archive or not, I do not know.
We're going to do as we have each one of our programs, open up our phone lines now for about 20 minutes for your telephone calls. We very much welcome your questions or your comments. Here are the telephone numbers. For Democrats watching us, it's 202-737-0001. Our line for Republicans is 202-737-0002. And our line for Independents, 202-628-0205. Before our first phone questions come in, we have a clip that we're going to show of the former president with a colleague of yours, Patricia Birchfield, and the former president. Can you tell us a little bit about the setting for this when this took place?
Well, this took place right before the museum reopened to the public, and Patricia is giving the president a tour of the museum. They start in the Oval Office and continue into our brand new Situation Room.
Let's take a look.
So from 1973 to 1974, he was the chairman of the Republican Party, just in time for Watergate. This interactive exhibit is a letter that George Bush wrote to his boys about Watergate and what a bad thing it was.
You can sort out our blessings
how
as a family.
Disappointed he
We have a
was
close family. We have a lot of
in
love.
President
You
Nixon.
guys come home, and this sure is a blessing for Mom and me. We've got enough things. If we get sick, we can get well. Probably, or at least we can afford to pay the doctor and the schools. More blessings. You guys know no prejudice. You judge people on their worth. You give your grandmother and your parents a lot of happiness. You will do well in a world full of opportunity. Our country gives us a whale of a lot, and so we are privileged people in a privileged country. We are in the best of times. My dad felt strongly the firm obligation to put something into the system. He felt compelled to give, to be involved, and to lead. And that brings me to the worst of times. I mean the part about Watergate and the abysmal immorality it connotes. When I heard of the taping in the White House, I felt disturbed and concerned. The public concern was not with the taping, but with what's on the tapes. To me, it's just plain wrong to tape all those conversations, but I guess that's an old-fashioned view. These have been a tough 18 months. I feel battered and disillusioned. I feel betrayed, in a sense, by those who did wrong and tracked corruption and institutional subversion into that beautiful White House. In trying to build party, I feel like the guy in charge of the Titanic boiler room. One damn shock after another. But two, I retain a basic confidence in the president's ability. I will never feel the same around the president after all of this, but I hope he survives and finishes his term. I think that's best for the country in the long run. I expect it has not been easy for you to have your dad as head of the RNC at this time. I know your peers must put you in funny positions at times by little words and jests that don't seem funny, by saying things that hurt you because of your family loyalty. I can't wait to see you all in August. I'm still family champion backgammon. Devotedly, Dad.
And you are looking at live pictures from the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station, Texas. And we're going to go to phone calls. San Francisco, California, first up.
Yeah, I'm wondering, does the historian believe it was Ross Perot when he lost re-election in 1992?
Good question. Speculative. Certainly, actually, it's interesting. I think most of the polling data that was done at the time indicated that Perot drew roughly evenly from the two parties. But in a larger sense, Perot would not have been in the race, I think, if there had not been a vacuum, an opening for him created by the president's unpopularity.
Houston, Texas.
Yes, ma'am. I'm blind, and I have a seeing eye dog, and we were at the library last year, and my question to Mr. Finch is, why was the Americans with Disabilities Act part of the library so small? I mean, I was really disappointed since that was the cornerstone, in my opinion, of his presidency.
Warren Finch.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to completely redo the museum so that one of the weaker points in this museum before the redesign was the domestic policy of President Bush, and it's one of the areas that we've expanded in much greater detail. We now have documents, video, news coverage, and artifacts or materials from our own archive. So there is much more you'll find now on the ADA and the museum than before.
And
that's the reason that from time to time you have to do it.
And during the second hour of our program, we'll feature more of the presidential years of George Herbert Walker Bush. Next telephone call is from San Diego. You are on the air, and welcome.
Good evening. Thanks again for a great series. I'm jumping ahead probably in the program kind of mode here, but I'm curious. George Bush was a great president as far as I'm concerned, and I think when he went into Iraq the first time, with Desert Storm, he had a clear mandate, and that mandate did not include going to Baghdad. I think personally he took a lot of flack over adhering to the rules of the road, and I know politically here in the States he took a lot of flack. Do you think, Mr. Smith, that he realized this would be part of the kind of the problem that he would face in regards to the political kind of outbursts at home?
Well, I think he was prepared for it. He certainly had a ready defense when people said, why didn't you go to Baghdad? He said then, and he has said many times since, quite simply because it meant we would have to run Iraq. And that was not, as you point out, that was not part of the mandate. Remember, he'd gone to the United Nations. He had put together this international coalition. He had gotten support from the Congress. And no one really had voted for the United States occupying Iraq.
We're talking about the 41st President of the United States today as we visit his presidential library in College Station, Texas. Next call is from Montgomery, Alabama, and you're on the air.
Yes, I was just wondering how much of the museum is actually devoted to the President's service during World War II.
Warren Finch.
A very large portion of the library is devoted to his service in World War II. We have a replica of the plane he flew, a TBM Avenger. We also have the letters he wrote home to his mom and dad during his career in World War II. And I said before, we have the film clip of him being rescued at sea after he was shot down near Chichijima. Plus, we have a model of the ship he served on.
St. Clair.
So it's a major part of the museum.
St. Clair, Michigan.
Hello, hats off to C-SPAN for a wonderful program as always. My question to Dr. Smith. The 1964 Senate campaign ad for George Bush's bid for the Senate in '64, that ad seemed much more of an infomercial. It seemed so long and drawn out compared to today's 20-second, 30-second sound bites we see on television now. I guess the question is, did that run on television, or is that something designed for the state convention? It doesn't seem like it would keep viewers' attention if it ran on television.
Yeah, it was 4 minutes and 30 seconds long.
Yeah, well, you know, that's a fascinating question, because the fact is people used to buy 5-minute blocks, and it was a different culture. People had different attention spans, pre-MTV. I mean, you know, it's just a whole lot of factors that have led to the soundbite culture in which we live. But the fact is, people would buy 30-minute blocks and expect viewers to watch. But a 5-minute spot, particularly introducing a relative newcomer, was not at all unusual in 1964.
Warren Finch, this spot, not really a spot, you can't call 4 minutes and a half spot. This advertisement is part of the library's holdings. Can you add any more detail about how it was used by the campaign in '64?
Well, I'm almost certain that Richard's right. It was part of a block of time. That's the way campaigns ran their ads. that was back when there was 3 networks and not all the cable outlets there are now. So I'm almost certain that that's the way it ran as a campaign commercial in 4 minutes.
Boston, you are next. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm interested in knowing, as it would apply to all the presidential libraries, is there a fund set aside by the libraries to acquire material, presidential material, sell on the open market like on eBay? And is there a campaign to encourage people to donate to the libraries?
Well, thanks very much for asking about that. I want to have both of our guests talk about it. Richard Norton Smith, from the perspective of working at many political libraries and several presidential libraries. How's it work?
Well, there is nothing systematic about it, to be honest with you. But it is true that each of these libraries has a foundation that builds the library and goes on actually to fund a lot of programs at the library. And in some cases, they will actually purchase the kinds of materials that the gentleman is referring to.
How's it work at the Bush Presidential Library, Warren Finch?
Well, of course, we encourage people who worked in the President's administration and people who have materials that shed a light on his administration, his life, to donate them to the library. We really have not gone out on eBay or bought materials for the collection. Collectors have been very generous to us, and we haven't had to do that.
We're going to go back to talk more about the life of George Bush. Now we are in the post-Watergate period. We had talked earlier about the diaries chronicling his speculation and desire about becoming vice president. Here's another entry. This one is from August 9th, 1974. The rest of the day was swirling around on the vice presidential speculation. We got our telegrams out asking for input from the National Committee. Quiet evening. Suspense mounting again. Deep down inside, I think maybe it should work this time. I have that inner feeling that it will finally abort. I sure hope not. Another defeat in this line is going to be tough. But then again, it is awful egotistical to think I should be selected.
Isn't that extraordinary? Talk about going back and forth, literally within the same sentence. In one breath, he's kind of up, and in the next, nah, I don't think it would quite work. One thing that should be pointed out here is, he had a long-standing relationship with the new president, because when he went to Congress in 1966, Gerald Ford had recently become minority leader, and really Ford looked upon Bush, as everyone did, as someone who had a very bright future in the House of Representatives. So they had a pre-existing friendship, and it was not unrealistic for Bush to think of himself, because a lot of people were suggesting that he would make a very good vice president.
And as we found out, it was ultimately Nelson Rockefeller who got the nod for vice president, and Warren Finch has George Bush's phone notes when he heard the news.
He actually he got the news at Kennebunkport, Maine, and he jotted down some notes. He heard earlier in the day that he was not going to be selected, that Nelson Rockefeller was going to be selected, and he wrote those notes down. And then a little bit later in the day, he actually got a call from the president, President Ford, telling him that he had selected Nelson Rockefeller to be vice president. And he speaks about being half a wave from the sea, so he was up at Kennebunkport, Maine.
Our next telephone call is from Cincinnati. You're on the air.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, I was interested as to why George Bush was chosen for such a diverse variety of positions throughout the government, such as the head of the CIA, the ambassador to the United Nations, and the chairman of the Republican Party. I was just wondering if you could expound on why he in particular was qualified to do such a diverse series of positions. Thank you very much. I appreciate your show.
Mr. Smith.
Well, I think there's a certain element of accident, coincidence, timing involved, but also he was someone who had, as I said, in the House he had impressed people as someone with a bright future. He was someone who had demonstrated an ability to work across the aisle with Democrats. It's very interesting, on Inauguration Day 1969, he was not at the Nixon inaugural. He went to the airport to bid farewell to Lyndon Johnson, which was an interesting symbolic gesture. So he'd made a lot of friends, he'd impressed a lot of people, and he had a growing interest in foreign policy. And I think his performance, particularly at the United Nations, is the key to the rest of his career.
Southold, New York, you're on the air.
Hi,
Welcome.
my question is to either Mr. Smith or Mr. Finch. This is concerning a very controversial figure in George Bush's life, Lee Atwater. I always thought he was very important in getting Bush elected back in '88. Do you think had he survived and didn't die of brain cancer, Bush might have had a better chance to be reelected in 1992?
Well, first, would you explain who Lee Atwater was?
Lee Atwater was a political operative. I think he came out of South Carolina, sort of brass knuckles tough. I said earlier I compared George Bush and Dwight Eisenhower. The parallel is neither one of them particularly were comfortable in the hurly-burly of politics, and they tended to delegate to subordinates, in some ways the dirty work. And Lee Atwater was a master political strategist who knew which buttons to push, which emotions to rouse, and he was a key figure, there's no doubt about it, in Bush's election in 1988. And then halfway through the administration, he was, as the caller said, diagnosed with brain cancer and died before the '92 campaign.
We're at the period of George Bush's career where he is head of the Republican National Committee, the Republican Party. Contrast the Republican Party he presided over with the Republican Party that Lee Atwater helped to craft through.
That's very interesting. Well, you know, in the early '70s, there was still a substantial moderate and even liberal wing of the party. There were a number of Northeastern Republicans, people like Jake Javits and Ed Brooke and others, Mac Mathias from Maryland. So it was if you will, the center of gravity was closer to the middle of the road. After Ronald Reagan changed everything. It became Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. And geographically, the center of gravity had moved to the south and west. Ideologically, it had moved to the right. And so George Bush, in some ways, found himself straddling this era from the relatively moderate Nixonian, pragmatic Republican Party to the more ideological Reagan-esque party.
We learned earlier that the former First Lady Barbara Bush was a scrapbook maker of the family's political career. Orrin Finch has some scrapbooks from the period of time where George Bush was head of the Republican Party.
Yes, and this is from the time where he finds out that Ford has nominated Rockefeller. And you see photos here, Pete Roussel, who was with the Bush campaign, a close associate of President Bush's, and these were taken right about the time that Bush found out that he was not going to be the Republican candidate.
And those are all...
Ford was going to choose Rockefeller.
All photographs from Kennebunkport. Is that correct?
They are.
Let's go back to telephone calls. Tawanda, Pennsylvania. You are on the air. Tawanda, welcome to the program.
This is Will Barr calling. I know that presidential homes are a very integral part of the history of our presidents, and I know the Eisenhower home is open to the public. They plan on opening the LBJ ranch to the public. This deals with some of our recent presidents. Do you know of any plans to eventually open Kennebunkport, the Kennedy compound, and similar homes to the public in the future as to help people understand their history and the way our presidents actually have lived?
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Richard Norton Smith, who does some work with the National Archives, if you know of any discussions with the families who still own these properties about their eventual...
No, that's a good question. Certainly, well, you know, going back, the Trumans and the Eisenhowers made that decision, and the call is right, the Johnson family. Mrs. Johnson lived in the ranch, but with the plans to, I believe, turn it over to the federal government following her death. But in terms of the more recent presidents, and particularly the compound at Kennebunkport, I don't know.
Next telephone call comes from Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Yes, this is Dylan Bashoner, and I was just wondering, do you think that the Republican Party would have been overall stronger or weaker had George Bush got the vice presidential nomination under Nixon rather than Ford?
Under Nixon rather than Ford. Well, that would have meant dumping Spiro Agnew in 1972, and although that may seem like a good idea in retrospect, it wasn't going to happen.
Next period of George Bush's career, he was named U.S. liaison to China.
You know what? I'm going to correct myself because I misunderstood that question. I think the caller meant when Agnew, I assume the caller now meant after Agnew resigned rather than 1972. You know, it's almost an impossible question to answer. The fact is, Congress said that Ford is the one candidate that we will confirm. without difficulty. And George Bush himself had to take himself out of the 76 race when he came back to the CIA before he could be confirmed. So I'm not sure that Bush could have been confirmed by Congress. Anyway, I'm sorry.
That's all right. At the library, they have, at the museum, they have an exhibit about the period of George Bush's career when he was U.S. liaison to China. When was he named, how long was he there, and what were the highlights?
Well, this was right after the Rockefeller nomination. The President and Ford met, the President and Bush met, and they discussed a number of possibilities. Bush wanted something in foreign policy, and they talked about the Court of St. James, the ambassador to London, which traditionally had been a very expensive position for its occupant, and they talked about China. And interestingly, George Bush said that he would like to go to China. This was a critical, formative period in the U.S.-China relationship. We did not yet have formal diplomatic relations, and it was an opportunity for the Bushes to practice a personal diplomacy that would really become their forte.
And it was also a period when the president-to-be kept diaries. And here's one of his diary entries about China. In a selfish sense, I do not see this as a political dead end. Many political friends tell me, out of sight, out of mind. But I think in this assignment there is an enormous opportunity of building credentials in foreign policy, credentials that not many Republican politicians will have. Kissinger has mentioned to me twice, this must be for 2 years, George. You will do some substantive business, but there will be a lot of time when you will be bored stiff. I thought of Henry, and I am sure his role in having Nelson Rockefeller get the VP situation. But I will say that he was extremely generous in telling the Vice Minister of the Foreign Ministry, whose name I'm not going to try here, that I was close to the President. Now, what do you hear in that?
Well, first of all, he turned out to be prophetic. He, in fact, said later on, you know, if Ford had picked me for the vice presidency in '76, I might never have been president, might never have been on the ticket with Ronald Reagan, obviously, in 1980. And it is true that this, what, you know, the conventional thinking was, out of sight, out of mind, the other side of the world, turned out to be a very important chapter in Bush's preparation to be president.
And building those credentials.
And building those credentials.
And uses the expression himself.
And making those contacts and establishing those friendships.
Warren Finch, you have a scrapbook page from from Barbara Bush from the China days.
Yeah, she kept quite a number of scrapbooks for these China days, and you see photos of them touring China. There's a great picture here, kind of a candid of Henry Kissinger in China. She has a menu from a dinner in China, and also some of the headlines from some of the newspapers.
After China, George Bush was named to be head of the CIA. How did that come about, Richard Norton Smith?
The CIA was in deep trouble. There had been a series of congressional investigations. Morale had hit rock bottom. President Ford had asked for Bill Colby's resignation, and so there was a vacancy to fill. And he thought of George Bush. And Bush had become this kind of all-purpose utility man, someone, the go-to guy. And it was regarded as very much a political dead end in the sense that in order to be confirmed by Congress, Bush had to explicitly assure Congress that he would not be a candidate in 1976, presumably for vice president. That took him out of politics, and he was at the CIA for a year. I think universally he's regarded as the man who restored the agency's morale at a very difficult time.
And Warren Finch, during his term as CIA director, do you have collections from that period of time?
We have a small collection of his personal papers from his CIA career. The official records from his CIA career are at the National Archives.
And what about the Barbara Bush's scrapbooking?
Mrs. Bush kept scrapbooks on his CIA career like she did his entire career. And so we have a collection of scrapbook pages from that period in his life also. We have a copy of one of the pages right here.
And can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing?
Well, George Bush was brought in. He made a number of changes at the CIA. Of course, as Richard was talking about, the CIA was in big trouble when George Bush came in. And one of the interesting little articles here is George Bush, the CIA stopped using reporters and ministers as employees on the CIA payroll.
And we're almost at the top of our first hour here, and as we close it out, we're going to transition from George Bush's career before the presidency to discussing more about George Bush's relationship with the news media. The president refers to it frequently in his writings and even in this recent interview that we gave. And in our program, we're going to show you, for the first time ever on television, an event that happens here in Washington every year between top members of the political world, including the president and the press. It's called the Gridiron Dinner, and it's closed to press coverage, ironically. So no cameras are there except the White House television crew that follows the president around. So during this upcoming hour, you're going to see a little bit of a president performing for the press in this annual dinner, which is full of skits. Before that, let's hear a little bit of George Bush's thoughts about the press. Here's a diary entry from August 6, 1974. He writes, "The incivility of the press has been a disturbing and paralyzing kind of thing over the last few months. And now it continues. That bloodlust, the talons sharpened and clutched, ready to charge in there and grab the carrion of this president. I am sick at heart, sick about the president's betrayal, and sick about the fact that the major Nixon enemies can now gloat because they have proved he is what they say he is. No credit, no compassion, no healing, simply the meat grinder at work."
The more things change. You know, it is certainly disturbing to think that as ugly as things are today, it's really nothing new.
We are going to show you a little bit of what it looks like. As much as the complaining about the press and the president work together in this town, and it all comes together once a year at the Gridiron. And here is a look at the former president performing at a Gridiron dinner.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chief Justice and Mr. Speaker, President Broder. Let me just say that closer a few minutes ago was one of the most moving things I've seen in over 20 gridirons or dozen gridirons. And I salute the kind of gentler mood in the gridiron. I also remember an inspired moment that Barbara and I had after last year's dinner. Standing on a windy street corner, she in a trench coat, collar turned up, her long, flowing, red hair blowing in the wind, and both of us too proud to run after it. You may remember last year's dinner. Dave, it is 8 minutes after 11, the shortest show in gridiron history, and with his talent, that is a very good thing. Let me congratulate President Broder. Frankly, it's good to have an intellectual in charge at last. It took vision to predict that I'd be out of it after Iowa. It took depth to say that Dukakis would likely win the Southern vote. And it takes clairvoyance to work for a paper that 3 days before the election predicted Daniel Ortega by 30 points. Speech in the dark? Hey, this guy's been writing in the dark forever. And to all here, who work with him, I want to express my sincere appreciation for your cooperation in working with our beloved press secretary. He's come a long way from last year. When he went into that clothing store, Marlon said, "I'd like to see a bathing suit in my size." And the clerk said, "So would I." And look at him now. I think we've got a good team in place. And when the phone rang the other day, Scowcroft did run it through intelligence. Jim Baker checked everything out, so did Cheney. Sununu said, "We'll take the call." Certainly worth it. Never thought I'd hear from Elvis again. But
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries series concludes Friday, November 30th, when we'll be live from the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. Next Friday, we'll show you some segments that have not aired during our programs. Eleanor Roosevelt speaking with troops in the Pacific, Kennedy family home movies, Gerald Ford's Election Eve program from Air Force One, and others, as well as an interview with Sharon Fawcett, Assistant U.S. Archivist for Presidential Libraries. That's next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
Sunday, on Road to the White House, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, the only presidential candidate scheduled to deliver an address this week before the Federalist Society's annual convention in Washington. Also Sunday, former North Carolina Senator John Edwards at a New Hampshire Politics and Eggs breakfast at the Bedford Village Inn. Road to the White House, Sunday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. Eastern and Pacific, with Rudy Giuliani and John Edwards on C-SPAN, the network of Campaign 2008.
Now we continue our visit to the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas.
The way to do the president is to start out with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Then you add a little John Wayne. Here we go. Let's go over the rich. You put them together. You got George Herbert Walker Bush. That's the thing there.
Lots of comedians out there doing impersonations. Okay with me? At this juncture, need for balance. Somewhere between caution and prudence. Natural disasters, out of bounds. California earthquake, not my fault. San Andreas' fault.
You're looking at rarely seen television pictures of a president, this case President Bush, at the Washington Gridiron Club dinner, an off-camera event with the nation's leaders and the White House and National Press Corps that happens every year in Washington. This video is part of the collection of the George Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas. And on your screen right now is a live picture of the replica Oval Office at the Bush Library. Tonight we're going to be spending 2 hours, and we're in the second hour now, in College Station, and we're going to be taking you through parts of the library during this part of our program, and we're going to concentrate for the next 50 minutes or so on the 4 years of the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Our historian, Richard Norton Smith, tell us about the most important, we've already had calls about this, domestic programs of the president.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think probably the Americans with Disabilities Act was very significant. The Clean Air Act, which really broke a 10-year logjam in terms of its extension. There were increased funding for AIDS research, and of course there was the savings and loan bailout, which was something, in some ways, it's almost a metaphor for George Bush's domestic program. You can't really take credit for cleaning up a mess that you inherited because you were seen as a continuation as well as a corrective of the Reagan presidency.
Well, that's where I want to go next. How different were his policies and his political philosophy from Ronald Reagan's?
Well, you know, it's a very delicate subject. This was the first time in 60 years that a president of the same party had succeeded by election. And that would seem to be perfectly easy. But it's not, because by 1989, George Bush really won that campaign, in some ways walking a tightrope. He had convinced Ronald Reagan supporters that he was in some ways a third term for Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, remember, he talked about a kinder, gentler America, which was kind of a code word for a more moderate approach. So he was riding two horses. And he spent his entire presidency under the eagle eye of those on the right. And I think that influenced significantly many of his actions.
You're looking at some what will be familiar pictures to those of us of middle age or older in the audience, and for young folks, a lesson in history of the 1988 Republican Convention. And our host at the library is the library's director, Warren Finch, who has scrapbooks. Throughout the program, we've been showing scrapbooks kept by Barbara Bush about her family's political career. And you've got some pages from the '88 victory you'd like to show our audience.
Well, we do. We have some candid photos from the '88 victory. And you'll see she also saved something from St. Martin's Episcopal, the service in Thanksgiving for the election of her husband. And as you can see, I'm just going to pull a couple of these up. She wanted to get as many headlines on a scrapbook page as she could, so she kind of taped them one over the other. And in an odd sort of way, kind of the way most people do scrapbooking, they don't, all the photos and the headlines don't always match. She's also got a series of photos here from the Shrine Burn Hospital in California on the same page as the '88 campaign victory headlines and photographs.
Richard Norton Smith, we talked about his major domestic policy achievements. Let's move into the area for which the former president was most often known, that's foreign policy.
Sure. Well, this is, of course, a period of historic transition. The evil empire, as Ronald Reagan had christened it, is clearly in meltdown. It is a question of time before the satellites of Eastern Europe spin off, and indeed, by the time George Bush becomes president, the Soviet Union itself is about to implode. So it's on one hand, it's the triumph that Americans have been waiting 40 years to see, but on the other, it's a period of potentially great instability. And this is when you see George Bush, in many ways, shine. Not in the conventional sense, not occupying the bully pulpit. In some ways, it's what he doesn't do. He doesn't adopt a triumphalist approach to the collapse of the Soviet Union. He manages the end of the Cold War.
The library and the museum has on display for the public a very large section of the Berlin Wall. And you're looking at it now in a live picture from College Station, Texas. We talked to the former president about his library and his career, and specifically asked a question about his response to the wall coming down. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Why didn't you go to Berlin immediately after the wall went down?
Because it would have been a stupid thing to do. A lot of the press got around my desk there and said, "How come, Mr. President, you can't express the emotion of the American people and do what Gephardt and Mitchell say, go dance on the wall?" Look, this is going very well with the Russians. And for me to stick my finger gloating, making an ass out of myself, dancing on the wall, sticking my finger in Gorbachev's eyes would have been a crazy thing to do. And he has subsequently said that. It would have been terrible, and he was glad we showed certain restraint. We didn't know how the Russian legions were going to react. They had troops in the GDR, they had troops in Hungary, they had troops in Poland. We did not know whether the military would say, enough is enough, we'll show these gloating Americans, and, maybe depose Gorbachev, in any event stand up and use force. The Cold War ended without a shot being fired, and some of that is because we showed restraint, and that wasn't even a close call for me. But in this emotional climate, I can just hear the voices. I'll spare you who they were saying this stuff to me through the media, part of the media, through the media. Why don't you go do this? I mean, you know, sometimes you got to do what you think is right, and it was right not to go put my finger in Mikhail Gorbachev's eyes.
And there, once again, you see a big section of the Berlin Wall, which is on display in the library. By the way, these pictures from inside the library are being taken by our colleague Bill Heffley with the help of Steve Kehoe, part of the C-SPAN crew, who are helping to put together tonight's program. Richard Norton-Smith, what did you hear in what the President said?
Well, I think that goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the program. Dorothy Walker Bush's comment to her son, almost from childhood. Nobody likes a braggart. Nobody likes braggadocio. I think...
And the press came back in there again.
And the press came back, that's true. These are themes that run throughout here. But it's interesting because in a curious sort of way, George Bush, remember, had spent most of his life in a appointive position. In some ways, he always felt a little bit out of sync in having to do the grubby sorts of things that the modern, you know, media machine demands of a candidate for president. And and yet that really was a great strength during a period when restraint, from his perspective, was what was called for, not showboating, not political theater. And we'll see that again in the lead up to the Iraq War.
Another foreign policy hotspot was here in the Americas, Manuel Noriega and Panama.
Yeah, that's right. Well, of course, you know, Noriega had been an American client. There's no doubt about that. He'd been very useful for a while, and his usefulness ended by the mid-'80s. He'd become really an embarrassment to the Reagan administration and to many Panamanians, as he had turned his country increasingly into a haven for drug smuggling. There was an election in 1990. In fact, Jimmy Carter went with the blessings of the Bush White House, trying to negotiate a deal, accepting the results of a popular election. Noriega moved to annul that, and several months later, the administration's patience at an end. It sent in 25,000 troops in what it called Operation Just Cause.
And Mr. Finch, there is a section of the museum that talks about Panama and Manuel Noriega. What's one of the key items that you have on display for the public?
Well, we have this great target that was found in Noriega's headquarters by one of the commanders in Panama, and it has his name, Mark Cisneros, and President Bush's name on it, and it's Noriega was using it as target practice. It's kind of a scary piece.
And I also understand that you have an application for POW status from Manuel Noriega. What's that all about?
Well, we do. We have in our collection a copy of a letter from Noriega's attorney applying for POW status for the Commander-in-Chief of Panama.
And how was that responded to?
I think it was pretty sure it was responded to negatively, and Noriega was brought here to the U.S.
Well, in fact, how it all played out was that in December of 1989, President Bush sent American forces into Panama to capture Manuel Noriega. Here is what the President told the American people at the time about the operation, and following that, a reflection by the President from today on Manuel Noriega and the Panama events.
Fellow citizens, last night I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama. No president takes such action lightly. This morning, I want to tell you what I did and why I did it. Many attempts have been made to resolve this crisis through diplomacy and negotiations. All were rejected by the dictator of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, an indicted drug trafficker. Last Friday, Noriega declared his military dictatorship to be in a state of war with the United States and publicly threatened the lives of Americans in Panama. The very next day, forces under his command shot and killed an unarmed American serviceman, wounded another, arrested and brutally beat a third American serviceman, and then brutally interrogated his wife threatening her with sexual abuse. That was enough. General Noriega's reckless threats and attacks upon Americans in Panama created an imminent danger to the 35,000 American citizens in Panama. As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens. And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States. I contacted the bipartisan leadership of Congress last night and informed them of this decision. And after taking this action, I also talked with leaders in Latin America, the Caribbean, and those of other U.S. allies.
One place in this library is a target, and you're on that target, and it was all about Manuel Noriega.
Well, that target was a piece of cardboard, and with two names on it, Bush and Cisneros. Mark Cisneros was a major general, then maybe lieutenant general, who was in charge of our forces in Panama. And what people think is that Noriega, feeling embattled and surrounded, sat there with his own pistol shooting at the target. And pretty good shot. He might have been pretty close, I don't know, but there were a lot of bullets in my head. And there was a great hatred on his part. I think this was just about the time he saw he was going down, or that we were coming in. But anyway, it was captured in his headquarters, and Cisneros got it and gave it to me for the library here. Eventually for the library.
What do you think should happen to Manuel Noriega?
What happened to him?
What should happen to him?
I don't know. He's got several other places that want to put him on trial. In France is one, Panama is another. He served a lot of time here, but I'm not sensitive. I'm not very kind and forgiving about Manuel Noriega.
And you're looking at a live picture of the replica Oval Office at the Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station, Texas. Richard Norton Smith, how did the public and the international community react to the American decisions on Panama?
Well, actually, it enjoyed considerable popular support at home. And, it was very difficult for anyone. The notion of gunboat diplomacy, of the Yankee colossus invading a small Central American country was repugnant to many. But the problem was, once you got beyond that concept and were confronted with the reality of Manuel Noriega, he didn't have many defenders.
And through the 4 years of the Bush presidency, global events moved from the end of the Cold War and events around that in Germany and Europe. And then we just talked about Central America, and then the Middle East.
Absolutely. In his inauguration address, the president had said the day of the dictator is over. Noriega must not have been listening, and neither was Saddam, because in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein sent his troops into Kuwait, rapidly overran the country. There was very serious concern at that point that he might move on Saudi Arabia, in which case he would control something close to a majority of the world's oil reserves. This was an enormous challenge, economic and geopolitical, to the rest of the world. And the president very quickly decided that, in his words, this will not stand.
And Warren Finch, how does the museum tell the story of the first Gulf War?
Well, we do it in a couple ways. One, we have a replica of the White House Situation Room, which has the Gulf War timeline on computers, and you can go through the timeline and see the decisions that President Bush made. And in several of the situations, you're given choices, and you can pick one of the choices and see if it's the same choice that President Bush made. And then in another exhibit, we actually have a Gulf War tent where we tell the story of the Gulf War from the point of view of 3 soldiers who served in Desert Storm.
The former president, got a tour recently of this Situation Room and its interactive offerings very recently. Would you like to set that up for our audience? When did it happen again?
Go
ahead.
President Bush was here right before the museum opened, and Patricia Birchfield, the deputy director and curator, took him through the Situation Room and the Gulf War exhibit and had him talk about his thoughts about the Situation Room and the Gulf War exhibit and the Gulf War.
And we're going to watch a little bit of the former president as he tours the new Situation Room exhibit.
The Situation Room is actually in the ground floor of the West Wing of the White House?
West Wing, yeah. Right down, not below the Oval Office, but down below the Chief of Staff's office and those offices along there.
And when you were president, was this your spot?
You see the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates?
Yes.
Now the Secretary of Defense, formerly the president of this great university.
And that was putting the coalition together?
I'm not sure what we were doing, but that's the secure telephone there. And we were talking to some, must be some foreign leader or one of our general officers maybe.
And is this your chair when you would go to the Situation Room?
Yeah, let's see, I'm trying to turn around what it is. Now this looks very much like the real Situation Room. There's a little more room at that end of it because it was very crowded.
Right.
But it'd be great for people coming to see it. But yes, very much like it.
And did you come down here a lot?
Not a lot, but we'd have NSC meeting, National Security Council meetings here. I'd come down here for certain special briefings during the war. I'd come down and just ask them what the latest is, ask the people in the situation, or I'd call them up on the phone. What's going on over there? And they had a wonderful group of people manning it from the intelligence community, the military, State Department, and they'd have the latest news for the president.
But one of the interesting things is we put a dossier together of the famous gang, 7 of the members of the famous Gang of 8, and you can punch on that and get
Isn't that wonderful?
And get their story and their biography.
The thing that was good about them, they were harmonious. They'd have big differences, and then once Scowcroft would bring them down to the Oval Office if they couldn't work out the differences, they said, "Mr. President, you got to make a decision." I'd make the decision, and then whoever was in there, whether they agreed originally or not, would go forth and support the decision. We were very lucky to have a team that didn't go calling the behind the scenes to the Washington Post or getting their side of it out, you know, kind of leaking. Right. And it made it a lot easier to make decisions when you have confidence in your top national security people. And of course, Brent Scowcroft was the very best because he was very bright, but he was the honest broker between strong secretaries, Secretary of Defense Cheney, Secretary of State, the Vice President, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he'd make the decision. I mean, he'd try to get them to work out a decision, and when that didn't work, let's go down to the Oval Office. Walk down from his office, down past the our Chief of Staff's office, down to my office, and said, "Here's the problem. Here's what Defense thinks. Here's what State thinks. Now you must make a decision." And I would. And then these people were disciplined and mature, and stayed the course, stayed with what the president decided, which is the way it ought to work.
That's the former president touring the new exhibit on the Situation Room, which helps detail the 1990-91 Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and that's part of the exhibit in College Station, Texas. And right now, some video from the time as the then president welcomes and greets the troops who were fighting the first Gulf War. Richard Norton Smith, the war introduced in key positions Americans to Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell, people who became part of his son's administration. Tie all the pieces together.
Well, although, in fact, they had actually gone back to the Ford administration. There were a whole lot of folks, Don Rumsfeld and others, Jim Baker, who actually, the first Bush presidency was talked about as the second Ford term. Of course, the second Bush presidency, likewise, initially. The remarkable thing, though, about that war was President Bush's efforts beforehand to build and sustain a crazy quilt coalition, which included much of the Arab world. He went to the United Nations. He got formal approval to set a deadline before there was any military action. He went to the Senate, although he claimed he didn't have to, but he went to the Senate and won a debate there. Give you one example of the personal diplomacy and the dividends from not gloating at the time the wall came down. One major reason why the UN was as unified as it was because the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was willing to abandon its traditional ally Iraq and join forces with the United States.
One other name that has become particularly familiar to Americans during this Bush presidency, but also has some roots in the Bush 41 presidency, is a man by the name of Joe Wilson, Ambassador Joe Wilson. Tell us the story about what we're going to see next.
Well, you know, there are lots of surprising pieces of video in this series, but this probably takes the cake. Joe Wilson was the deputy chief of mission in Baghdad. I think the American ambassador was away.
And April Glaspie.
April Glaspie, that's right. And in defiance of Saddam's threats during this period, he actually helped evacuate several thousand Americans and other Westerners, and I believe provided shelter at the embassy for over 100 Americans. And in recognition of that, he was welcomed home as something of a hero.
And we should say the reason why this is particularly interesting in the current Bush presidency, Joe Wilson...
Well, of course, Joe Wilson is married to Valerie Plame, and of course the whole controversy / scandal regarding the leaking of her CIA status, which of course has become a cause célèbre, and needless to say, does not engender warm feelings in this Bush White House toward Ambassador Wilson.
But let's look back in time to President Bush 41, when Joe Wilson was welcomed at the White House for his efforts in Baghdad.
You just did a wonderful job.
This is Vice President Howard Joe Wilson. Good work. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. It's good to be back. Believe me.
Welcome
Mr.
home,
Secretary.
Joe. Welcome home.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Well, we were pitching for you there.
Well, thanks very much.
Well, did anybody ever tell you that I asked Aziz 3 times
I heard, yes,
to give me personal assurance that you would be permitted to leave, and 3 times he didn't answer, and I thought I'd have to go back to him on the 4th time.
Thank you. Jeanette PM and Bob Conrad.
Welcome back.
Good to see you. Good work. Thank you very much. From the very beginning, we felt that the hostage issue was not a diplomatic issue. It was a political and humanitarian issue.
I ask you why he let him out. I don't understand.
Pardon me?
I don't quite understand why he...
I think we finally got to it.
Yeah.
I think we did.
Really did.
It took a long time.
These guys won't write anything down. They're innocent, but the next wave, they might, though.
Like your socks. Look at those fancy socks.
We're going to take a vote on those. Paper socks. The vote, wait a minute. The vote goes against me. They pitch in and get
They're going to get that on.
I'm glad Barbara Bush isn't here.
And that was Joe Wilson being welcomed to the White House at a happier time between the Bush family and the Wilsons. That's a live picture right now from College Station, Texas, as we continue our Presidential Library series focusing on the 41st presidency of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. We have not talked about Mr. Bush's choice for vice president. We saw him in that last clip, the senator from Indiana, Dan Quayle. Will you talk a little bit about
That's right.
how he was selected and what he brought to the office?
Yeah, Dan Quayle, I believe, was 41, one of the younger vice presidents when he was selected to the surprise of many in 1988. In fact, it turned out he'd been in the House for a couple of terms, and he spent, I think, 8 years in the Senate at that point. He was thought to represent, again, we're talking about balance. He was a generational change. He also was someone who would, in many ways, serve the president as an outreach to the more conservative wing of the Republican Party. He brought that credibility with that wing, and that was important in the Bush White House. And you know, after certainly a baptism of fire in the '88 campaign, he settled in, and I think most people think he did a pretty good job.
What did he bring to the teamwork between the two? What was his function?
Well, he did a number of things. He had a long-time interest in defense issues, for example. He was, in some ways, a kind of advisor without portfolio, but he also took on specific assignments from the president, particularly in terms of the economy and the regulatory climate and the like. And again, he was a big fundraiser. He was a real draw at party events, and he really did develop a constituency of his own in the right wing of the party.
And we talked a lot about the press and its review, did the press corps and other observers ever let him get past that baptism by fire?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, I don't think they ever did. And of course, there were famous incidents like the misspelling of potato and the like that played into the image. But you know, the interesting thing is Quayle kept a sense of humor about it. Never, you know, he was no Agnew. He never went after the press, although he was a fierce competitor. And I think if you look at for example, if you look at the contrast between his performance in the debate with Lloyd Bentsen in 1988 and Al Gore in 1992, I think that says it all.
Presidents, when the country is at war, as it was in 1991, and Washington as a whole, just from your years of watching it and the years that I've been here, they struggle to find the right tone. And we're going to see another one of these gridiron dinner clips. Here's an event that's supposed to be about comedy and the like, yet there are troops on the battlefield. How did this administration handle it?
Well, I think the viewers can decide for themselves. It's always an awkward attempt to balance the traditional expectations of the evening with what is unique to a wartime situation. And I think the footage will speak for itself.
Let's watch.
March 1991. This is the gridiron dinner at the Washington Hilton Hotel. It's a closed event.
I'm very happy to see Kuwait's ambassador here, Al Sabra, the ambassador from Kuwait. I understand that during his recent travels with Jim Baker, Jim tried out some of tonight's jokes on him. And after hearing them, the ambassador said, "Don't you think we've suffered enough?" Now, but Jim put it well. We have been friends, and I have total confidence in him. Remember 1980? He's the guy who told me in New Hampshire, "Don't worry, let the guy from California pay for the mic." And I understand Epi Lederer is with us tonight over here at table 12. We all know her as Ann Landers. Apparently Bob Strauss wrote to her recently, and she asked me to read her response. "Dear Washington Wheeler Dealer," it says. "Yes, take the money from both sides." But this has been a very special evening with emphasis, understandably, on the Gulf, and it's great to have so many members of the press back from the Gulf in time for this gridiron. I know many of the reporters out there were roughing it lately. Sam Donaldson, though, said it wasn't so bad staying at the Sheraton Riyadh. In fact, he said the towels were so fluffy that he could barely get his suitcase shut. Some air war, wasn't it? I've just learned the 3 words every Iraqi pilot dreaded the most. Cleared for takeoff. Oh, crap. I haven't gotten so many laughs since my last speech on domestic policy. Thank you. Now the attention is turned back to the home front. Maybe Wolf Blitzer can go back to his real name. I'm glad that Politics 92 didn't rear its ugly head too much tonight. It did a little bit. And I understand that there is speculation already about the 92 race. In fact, just the other day, Jim Palmer sent a telegram to George McGovern. It read, "Heard you were considering a comeback. Stop." No, but it has been a special evening. I noticed that Bernie Shaw was sitting at the table instead of under it. And all kidding aside, though, really it has been, I think, the most enjoyable gridiron in many, many years. Barbara and I enjoy ourselves, always.
I must say that, with all respect to the two skits, and to Ambassador Strauss and to Secretary Baker, I think that the most moving part, the most wonderful part of the evening was the tribute to the troops. And there was a special line in it, you may have heard in the beginning, "Through the fog of distant war shines the strength of their devotion." And as I've said before, our soldiers and our sailors and our airmen and our Marines and our Coast Guardmen embody the ideals of honor and bravery, duty and country, and were willing to sacrifice for the sake of those simple words. And they liberated a nation abroad and helped transform a nation at home. So once again, Budge, my congratulations to you, sir. I thank you for a very special, enjoyable gridiron evening, and may God bless the families of all those soldiers that we lost in action. Thank you all very, very much.
And we are continuing our discussion of the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. Right now on your screen you see the exterior of the Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas. And it's all been renovated and it is open for your visit. If you are in Texas and love presidential history, there's a stop for you to make. Right now our phone lines are open, 202-737-0001 for Democrats, our line for Republicans, 202-737-0002, and our line for Independents, 202-628-0205. Warren Finch, you have more to tell us about the President and his gridiron appearances?
No, not a lot. Besides those three gridiron that you showed, I don't really have any more information.
Well, I have to say, this is just a point for me to get in. For people who didn't understand before, the reason why this is special is because those gridiron dinners are closed to cameras. As long as C-SPAN has been around, we've been asking for permission to get our cameras in to show you those. Now that we have the chance to show people, we've lifted the veil off, it's pretty tame stuff.
Well, except I'm not sure that having aired these tonight will increase the likelihood that the gridiron dinner will
Well, knowing
break
that
its
won't
rule.
happen, I get my point in here.
Yeah.
It's pretty tame stuff when you look at it.
It's pretty tame stuff.
Let's go to our first question. Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, you are on the air.
Hi. I was curious, would former President Bush, would he be considered more of a liberal Republican?
I mean, that goes to the heart of some of the things we've been talking about tonight. I mean, temperamentally, I think he's a moderate. He's someone, I think, uncomfortable with ideological labels. When he ran for Congress in 1966, he famously said, "Labels are for cans." But the fact is he found himself in a Republican Party that was moving steadily to the right, and he had to accommodate himself to that.
We're looking at the live picture of the replica of the Oval Office. Warren Finch, when this was set up, what period, which of the 4 years was it meant to capture? Which family photos were chosen for display, for example?
Well, this is it was chosen from the early period. The desk is kind of unique. It's a partner's desk. It has drawers on both sides, and it's one of the desks he used. And luckily, we had a donor that gave us a replica of that desk, so we're able to put a replica of the desk that looks exactly like the desk he used when he was president. The photos they had just lots of photos of the grandchildren on the back of the desk and the family. And it's a great opportunity for someone to walk into the Oval Office, sit down behind the desk, and we have a camera in the wall, and you get your picture taken.
How about that? What else is important to note about the Oval Office as it was set up during the Bush administration?
Well, the carpet on the floor is an exact duplicate of the carpet that was on the Oval Office floor, down to the color, and it was the same manufacturer. All the photos, the paintings on the walls were the same. I think what's kind of unique about President Bush's Oval Office is that it was just a number of pictures of the grandchildren. You know, he's said he was in the grandchildren business. He enjoyed his grandchildren. We have film of the grandchildren greeting him at Kennebunkport, Maine, and so there are a lot of photos. There were a lot of photos in the White House of President Bush and his family and his grandchildren. He was really a family man.
Ann Arbor, Michigan. You're on the air.
Hello?
Hello. You have a question?
Yeah. I wanted to know about when he was a young congressman. I heard that he supported like open housing, and because of that, his offices in Houston were firebombed. because he was, you know, wanted to open up housing and stuff. And can he speak to that? And also, my father got a chance to meet President Bush in China. He was over there working on a dissertation with some other doctoral students, and they met what's that guy's name, Mao Zedong, and they met Zhou Enlai, and they met Bush. He was something called the Chargé d'Affaires or something like that. I remember my father telling me about that. But could you answer those two questions? And I couldn't. There were a lot of people that were really mystified how he picked Dan Quayle. I don't understand that one. It's so odd.
Okay,
Thank you.
For the call. The open housing.
He was a supporter of open housing
What does
legislation.
the term mean?
Well, it's basically a civil rights bill, which is an extension of the bills of 64 and 65, and in some ways even more controversial because it addresses the issue of de facto segregation and is designed to break up whites-only neighborhoods, for example. And so it was a very controversial and a defining act, and frankly, it was a vote that displayed some real political courage.
Actually, this is a good time to talk about the 1992 LA riots.
Well, you know, Queen Elizabeth, who visited the Bush White House, called 1992 her annus horribilis, and I think the same term could apply to the year for George Bush. You had an economic recession take hold, and then of course you had the LA riots, which were absolutely devastating, and we were just beginning to get into cable news and the 24/7 news cycle, so the way we covered these stories was subtly different than in the past. And then you had another disaster, of course, Hurricane Andrew, which was compounded by a bureaucratic disaster in the what was perceived to be the failure of FEMA, the government emergency response team. So all of this really sort of came together, and it fed an impression of a president who, though well-intentioned, was out of touch with the ordinary American.
There you see some video of the former president who, at 92 as he was touring the area in Los Angeles that was devastated by the rioting there. Warren Finch, how does the library handle this series of domestic crises that the president faced in 1992?
Well, it's one of the areas of the exhibit that we've really upgraded is domestic policy. We have these great computers that show some of the documents from our collection and a lot of the video, and the Los Angeles riots is one of the subjects we carry. We show President Bush out in Los Angeles.
Houston, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I was wondering if the Presidential Library in College Station intends to have any exhibition concerning the recently released disagreement between father and son Bush regarding the son's criticism of the father for not going to Baghdad.
Mr. Finch?
Well, I think President Bush supports his son.
And that's all you want to say on that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's much to add. I mean, there's been sort of armchair psychology about this relationship going on from the beginning of the second Bush presidency, but it's very clear that there's a real bond, a loving bond between father and son, whatever disagreements may exist.
Kingman, Arizona. Oh, you've got your audio turned up on your television set. Hit the mute button, please.
Yes. There we go.
Okay, you have a question for us?
Yeah, I guess it follows on along with the former question. I was wondering, as a former veteran of the first Gulf War, if the former President Bush had any thoughts about the current situation that we're in right now, if he would have went in and taken Saddam out in the first place.
He has not been speaking out about it's interesting. I mean, I'm going to ask you this from a historical perspective. We've not had the experience of a father-son president, and
no one interviewed John Adams. What he thought about
And his approach to it has been to remain silent.
Well, it's been actually more than that. It's been to be as vocally supportive as he can of his son, and to put it in the context of, I mean, just recently speaking to audiences, it's no different from any of your homes. If you've got a son that you love who's in a difficult position, you lend him unquestioning support.
But he does not answer policy questions.
He does not answer policy questions. Yeah, well, I suppose he's at an age where he can sort of beg off, but I think clearly it's an awkward situation. And once you answer one policy question, where do you stop?
You were looking at the Oval Office replica that's just been newly launched in the Bush Presidential Library. The former president had a tour of that with the curator of the library. Let's watch.
Do you remember the first time you were in the Oval Office?
No, I really don't. It was long before I became president or vice president, just as a tourist. But I couldn't begin to guess when that was. Maybe when my dad was in the Senate, which would have been 1951 or 2, something like that.
With President Eisenhower?
Yeah, well, I wasn't with him. I was just kind of touristy. My dad arranged just for me to see it.
Okay. Okay. We also...
I still feel the same sense of awe when I left as president, 8 years as vice president, 4 years as president, as I did that day when I went in there. Just, it's an awe-creating experience.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Do you remember the first visitor to your Oval Office when you were president?
My mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, first visitor. And there's a picture of it we've got somewhere. I don't think it's right there, but there's a picture of it on my desk in Houston. And I'll never forget it. And then the first picture of the current president was when I was warming up after the parade. The inaugural parade. It was icy cold. I was in the bathtub up in the Queen's bedroom in the White House, and one of my friends there that's on the staff came, "Mr. President, get going. Your son wants you to go over to the Oval Office." I said, "Look, I'm trying to thaw out. Get going." So I jumped in, put my suit back on, and there walked over, and then had this first picture taken with the president.
You were his first visitor.
That's right.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Nice history there.
And despite his interest in staying there, George H.W. Bush was to spend just 4 years in the Oval Office. We haven't yet talked about the 1992 campaign. Will you set the stage for it?
Well, sure. First of all, he had a rebellion on the right. Pat Buchanan ran against him and polled very strongly in New Hampshire and some other primaries before dropping out of the race. So he was a wounded incumbent. The recession was weakening, and it's curious, as high as his poll numbers went right after the Gulf War, they came down just as fast. And I think at one point in 1992, we had a 29% approval rating. Well, it's awfully tough to get reelected. You had Ross Perot, who ran an insurgency that weakened the president. And Bill Clinton came out of nowhere and proved himself to be a formidable opponent.
And you're looking at some scenes of the President and First Lady campaigning. And now back to the library in College Station, Texas, and the Oval Office replica. And Warren Finch, the director of the library. We saw Barbara Bush in the '88 election in her scrapbooks capture the huge headlines about the family's success in winning the White House. What did the scrapbooks look like in 1992 at the loss?
Well, she also, of course, kept pictures in her scrapbooks of the loss, and they were very, very gracious to the Clinton administration, and were very helpful with the transition. And I think you can see in the newspaper photos of Mrs. Bush greeting Mrs. Clinton that graciousness.
And as we're looking at that, I'd like to use this moment, because we have just a few minutes left in the program, to say thanks to some people at the library. You've met Warren Finch and Patricia Birchfield on video tonight. Special thanks also to Mary Finch, Brooke Clement, Debbie Carter, and Brian Blake for their assistance in putting tonight's program together. And from the C-SPAN staff, our program is directed in College Station by Sherry Sanders Smith. Our producer is Connie Debley. Here in Washington, Greg Sizowitz is our director. Mark Farkas has been our executive producer for this entire series, and Mark, just one more to go in this 12-week process. And on camera in College Station, Linwood Moore and Dallas Hill, and our engineer is Robert Gould. You're looking at pictures from the 1992 loss of the White House in the contest that that put the Bush family against the Clinton family, and that history continues in American politics. During his presidency, Mr. Bush continued to write letters, and we talked in this program about what a letter writer he was. From our interview with Mr. Bush, conducted last week, he talks about what he left on the Oval Office desk for Bill Clinton, and let's listen.
People coming to this library will be able to see for the first time what was probably your last letter that you wrote as President of the United States, and that was your letter to Bill Clinton. What was going through your mind as you were writing that letter to him?
Well, that I'd lost the election. I'd let a lot of people down. He had won fair and square, and I wanted to wish him well. So it's just kind of a human reaction, and I'm glad I did that. But probably, if you would have done the same thing today, if you just fast forward, I mean, if I just lost the election today, I probably would have done the same thing, not sent him a BlackBerry, sent him an email.
You said to him, don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. And when President Reagan left you a note, it was a little bit more terse. It just said, don't let the turkeys get you down. Criticism and how you react to it, how a president reacts to it.
Well, first place, you better be hard enough skinned to know you're going to get plenty of it. And some of it's fair and some of it is grossly unfair in your own opinion. So you have to learn to live with it and go on and do your job. And so you'll never get used to being torn apart in the media. And the national media, they like to get you down and then push you under. And it just goes that way. The pack journalism. And it's nasty. It's nasty today, and it was nasty back in 1992, and I expect Bill Clinton would have said the same thing. But this is the way it is, and you got to live with it. That's the price you pay in an open society.
And there on White House stationery, Warren Finch, is what for our viewers to see?
Well, we have first, we have the copy of the letter that President Bush left Bill Clinton. It is a copy, but you'll see in the right-hand corner President Bush's original handwriting left on a desk in Oval Office, and then next to it also is original copy of the note that President Reagan left Bush on turkey stationery.
And can you tell us what that says?
Well, basically, the letter to Clinton says basically there are going to be tough times. The media is going to be at you at times. They're going to be tough times. Don't let it get you down. And the letter to George Bush, says that they're basically the same, but in shorter format. That they're going to be tough times, and don't let the tough times get you down.
And the stationery much more whimsical, isn't it, from on the Reagan letter?
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, we have seen the video of the former president touring the facility recently with your new renovations. How involved overall is the Bush family in the Bush Library?
Well, they're here in the winter and spring a lot, 2 or 3 times a month. We do a lot of programs here at the Bush Library, a lot of speakers. The President Bush is in the museum visiting with our visitors. Mrs. Bush does the same. So they are very active here in the community in College Station and feel at home here. There's a conference center across the plaza from us. The President and Mrs. Bush have an apartment there and some offices there, 300 and 600 seat auditorium and a banquet facility. They're very active here in the community.
And how many visitors does the library get every year?
Well, it fluctuates from year to year. Of course, we've just gone through a major renovation, but last year we had about 140,000 visitors.
And what about the library part of it? How frequently and what kinds of things do people who are doing research, tell us some stories about how that has worked for you.
Well, as time goes on, more and more of the materials are getting open. We actually have records open on the Gulf War. That period gets a lot of research. We had heavy research when we first opened into MIAs and POWs. The HIV policy of the Bush administration, and both Supreme Court Justice Souter and Supreme Court Justice Thomas both get heavy research.
Well, thank you so much for hosting our our visit this evening and for allowing our cameras to give viewers around the country a tour of your new renovations. We very much appreciate it.
And I really would like to thank C-SPAN and all your staff. They've done a fantastic job here at the Bush Library.
We're glad to be there. We're always interested in history. As we close here, we're going to show another one of these off-the-record gridiron events. Again, they're comedy skits. This one is from 1992. And in the days of Jay Leno, you're going to have to give a little bit of background as to what this is all about here.
This is a time capsule, really a cultural artifact in some ways. You know, this evening we've seen in his diaries and his letters a side of George Bush that I don't think the public often saw. In many ways very attractive. And that goes double for what we're about to see. This is a very unusual clip in which George Bush does a takeoff on a long-running skit that Johnny Carson of The Tonight Show made famous, Karnak the Magnificent, except in this case it's, I believe, Termac the Magnificent, in which the president does a, well, you
He's
can
a
see
psychic.
He's a psychic, exactly, and he holds up, the routine, the shtick is, he holds up he gives the answer, and then opens the envelope and reads, in effect, the question.
Well, let's see how it all plays out for President Bush at the 1992 Gridiron Dinner. Thank you for being with us.
Here, old great mystic, is the first question.
The ideal Detroit, Michigan soundbite. Ich bin ein Mercedes-Sohn.
Very good, Mr. Very good.
Que sera, sera.
Que sera, sera.
Look, two Payless ones, stay quiet. Que sera, sera. Spanish for read my lips.
Carmack on a roll tonight. Number 2.
Quiet, my full-figured flack. Saddam Hussein, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Paul Saunders. A scud, a stud, and a fud. Lee, the NEA chairman. Wheel of Fortune, McLaughlin Group, and Mario Cuomo. A game show, a talk show, and a no-show. Looking for the union label. What did Lane Kirkland tell the press he was doing in the Ramada Inn with 3 members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union? Then you contract terminal writer's block. Quiet. Russian capitalism, Reebok pumps, supermarket scanners. Russian capitalism, Reebok pumps, supermarket scanners. Name 3 new inventions in 1992. $1 billion.
$1 billion.
Quiet. What's the minimum contribution Ross Perot will accept on his 800 number. Galapagos Islands National Aquarium and Jerry Brown. 3 places where you find a lot of turtlenecks. Astronaut Sergei Krikalev. Who spent more time out of his country than George Bush? Man of 1,001 inches around the waist.
Here we have the last question.
May your firstborn daughter marry a congressman and your maid Nielsen rating be as low as mine. 3 words. It will bring the house down.
Now, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, and explores the life and career of our 41st president.
Mr. President, what is it that you want this library to do?
I want it to accurately reflect the 41st presidency in the United States of America. And I think it does. And it takes, my mother always said, nobody likes a bragger. And so I apologize to my mother long in heaven for making, because it is all about me, but it's also about the presidency, how it works, how supportive the staff, top staff was, how the system works. And I think it's just a kind of a vignette look at history through the
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. As part of the Presidential Library series, C-SPAN Radio will air exclusive interviews with former President Bush, one recorded in 1999 for our American Presidents series, and our latest interview with the former president recorded just last week at the Bush Library. That's tomorrow on C-SPAN Radio at 3 p.m. Eastern. C-SPAN's Presidential Library series concludes Friday, November 30th, when we'll be live from the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. Next Friday, we'll show you some segments that have not aired during our programs. Eleanor Roosevelt speaking with troops in the Pacific, Kennedy family